She was 34 years old the winter she buried her husband, and watched the bank take everything else. It was Silas Merrick, president of the Larkspur Valley Trust, who signed the paper that put her off her own land, and he did it, he said, only because the numbers demanded it. When the wagon finally stopped shaking beneath her, she had $19 sewn into the hem of her coat, a dog curled against her boots, and nothing else in the world she could call hers. So when she heard that the old trading post out past Widow's Creek was going up for auction because no one wanted it, she did the thing every sensible person in Larkspur Hollow told her not to do. She bought a ruin for $22. She did not yet know that something had been sealed inside its walls for 30 years, waiting, or that her dog would be the one to find it, or that what came next would not just save her, it would save the whole town that had turned its back on her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clementine Ashford and her faithful dog, Copper. If a story about quiet courage and the kind of loyalty that digs through walls to find the truth means something to you, we'd love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Tell us in the comments below. Clementine Ashford had been raised to believe that a woman's worth was measured in what she could mend, not what she was given, and she carried that belief the way other people carried scripture. She had grown up the middle daughter of a blacksmith in the river town of Millard's Bend, in a house that smelled always of coal smoke and beeswax, where her father kept a forge going from before dawn until the light gave out, and her mother kept 3 younger children fed on an income that never once matched the size of the family it had to stretch across. It was her father who taught her to look at a broken thing, a hinge, a wheel rim, a man's pride, and see not what it had failed to be, but what it might still become, if someone was patient enough and stubborn enough to work it back into shape. It was her mother who taught her that patience was not the same as weakness, and that a woman who kept her own counsel and her own accounts was a woman nobody could easily ruin. Clementine took both lessons and folded them into herself so deeply that by the time she was 17, neighbors were already bringing her their broken clocks and cracked china and asking, half in jest, half in earnest, whether the blacksmith's girl could fix that too. She met Daniel Ashford at 19, when he came through Millard's Bend, driving a small herd north, and stopped long enough to have his wagon axle repaired at her father's forge. He was not a wealthy man, nor a particularly ambitious one, but he had a way of looking at Clementine as though she were the most interesting puzzle he had ever been given the privilege of studying, and that was enough. They married within the year, and moved west together, to Larkspur Hollow, a town cupped in a green valley beneath the shoulder of Cutbank Ridge, where Daniel took up a modest parcel of land, and Clementine set about turning a bare cabin into a home with the same patient hands she had once used on broken hinges. It was in their 3rd year in the valley that a half-starved red hound pup wandered onto their porch during a spring storm, ribs showing, one ear torn, too frightened to come closer than the bottom step. Daniel wanted to shoo him off toward some other homestead. Clementine set down a bowl of broth instead, and sat on the step in the rain until the pup found the courage to eat from it. She named him Copper, for the way his coat caught the firelight, and from that night onward, he never slept anywhere but at the foot of her bed, and never let her walk to the well, or the henhouse, or the church steps in town, without trotting a careful half-pace ahead of her, as if he had appointed himself her scout, in a world he did not entirely trust. The Hollow, in those years, was a town that believed in itself. It had been founded some 3 decades earlier by a handful of families, the Pruitts, the Calders, the Osgoods, the Fentresses, who had pooled what little capital they carried west and built, among other things, a trading post at the crossing of the old Cutbank Road, run for years by a solitary, close-mouthed fur trader named Jedediah Pruitt. Pruitt had been, by every account Clementine ever heard, an odd and private man, trusted by the founding families precisely because he wanted nothing from anyone, and it was said, though said so long ago and so often, that no one quite remembered if it was history or legend, that when the town's founders had pooled money to build a proper schoolhouse and a church, It was Pruitt who had been entrusted to hold the funds safe until enough was gathered, because a man who wanted nothing was a man who could be trusted with everything. Then, one autumn, Pruitt simply stopped opening the Post's shutters. He was found dead of a fever within the week. The fund was never located, the schoolhouse was never built, and the trading post was shuttered and left to the weather, a monument to a promise the town had never managed to keep. By the time Clementine arrived in the valley, it was less a building than a rumor, sagging under 30 years of snow, its windows blind with dust, a place children dared each other to run up to and touch. Clementine learned all of this the way one learns the furniture of a new home, passively, in pieces, over suppers and church socials, and thought little of it beyond a mild, private sympathy for whoever had lost that money and never gotten it back. She had her own household to keep, her own garden to coax out of rocky soil, her own husband to love, and her own dog to raise, and for 6 good years, that was a full enough life. Daniel worked the land, and traded a little in cattle. Clementine wove and mended, and, in time, kept the modest accounts for 2 other homesteads besides her own, because her reputation for honest, careful bookkeeping had followed her all the way from her father's forge. Copper grew from a trembling pup into a broad-chested, steady-eyed hound, who understood, better than most people did, when Clementine needed quiet, and when she needed company, and who took it upon himself, without ever being asked, to guard the cabin door at night, and to walk the fence line each morning, as though the whole homestead were a duty entrusted personally to him. It was, Clementine would say later, the last truly easy stretch of her life, and she had not known enough then to be grateful for how easy it was. The fall, when it came, did not come all at once, the way a storm comes, but the way a rope frays, slowly, in small places, until the whole thing gives at once without warning. It began with 2 bad years of drought that thinned the herd and thinned the harvest, the kind of years every homesteader in the valley suffered, and every homesteader in the valley expected to survive, because that was the bargain of the land. Daniel had taken a loan against the property from the Larkspur Valley Trust to see them through the second dry summer, a modest sum, the kind of loan half the valley carried at one time or another, secured against next year's herd and next year's harvest, both of which he fully intended to have. He did not live to see either. He was thrown from a green broken horse in the spring of the 3rd year, struck his head against a fence post, and was gone before Clementine could reach him, Copper barking and circling the fallen man in a frantic, useless vigil until she arrived. Grief alone might have been survivable. What was not survivable, or nearly not, was what came after, when Silas Merrick, who had inherited the presidency of the trust from his father 2 winters before, and had, in that short time, developed a hunger for land that his father had never shown, called the loan due within 90 days, citing terms in the paperwork that Clementine, in her grief, had not thought to read as closely as she read every other ledger that crossed her table. She went to him in his office above the mercantile, in the black dress she had not yet had occasion to take off, and asked, with what dignity she could still muster, for time. Merrick was polite. He was always polite. He explained, in the calm, regretful tone of a man discussing weather rather than ruin, that the bank's obligations to its own creditors did not bend for personal tragedy, however sympathetic he was to her situation, and that he was certain a woman of her evident resourcefulness would land on her feet. He did not mention, though Clementine would later have cause to wonder about it, that the parcel he was foreclosing upon happened to sit directly between 2 other properties he had quietly acquired that same year, nor that a man who controlled the whole run of land along Widow's Creek might one day find himself in a position of considerable influence over the entire valley. At the time, she heard only the word foreclosure, and the word 90 days, and beneath them, unspoken, the older and crueler word, alone. She sold what she could sell, the furniture, the tools, the herd Daniel had spent years building, and paid down what she could pay down, and still the day came when the trust's men arrived with the paper that ended it. And Clementine Ashford walked off the only home she had made for herself in the world, with a borrowed wagon, a trunk of what remained, $19 sewn into her coat hem, and Copper riding at her feet, with his chin resting heavy and watchful on her boot, as though he understood, in the particular way dogs understand grief, that his job now was simply to not leave her side. The town watched her go with the soft, uncomfortable pity people reserve for a misfortune they are relieved is not their own, and more than one neighbor murmured that it was a hard shame, a genuine hard shame, and then went back to their suppers. It was in that condition, widowed, landless, with $19, and a dog, and a wagon that was not even hers, that Clementine first heard about the county auction of abandoned parcels, held twice a year on the courthouse steps in the county seat, where properties too small, or too worthless for anyone serious to bother with, were sold off for whatever a body would pay, usually to be stripped for lumber and forgotten. She had gone, if she was honest with herself, mostly out of a stubborn refusal to sit still in her grief, and mostly expecting to watch and learn and leave. But when the auctioneer called the old Pruitt trading post, 30 years shuttered, roof half caved, better fit for kindling than commerce, he said, and the crowd laughed a little, something in Clementine went very quiet and very awake at once. She thought of her father, looking at a broken hinge and seeing what it might still become. She thought that a building, unlike a marriage or a herd or a harvest, could not be taken from her by a man's signature on the right piece of paper, not once she owned it outright. She raised her hand before she had entirely decided to, and when the bidding faltered after only 2 other half-hearted offers, Clementine Ashford bought the ruin of the old trading post at Widow's Creek Crossing for $22, leaving her with barely enough to feed herself and Copper through the walk back to the hollow, and every person who heard about it in the days that followed agreed, in the particular unanimous way small towns agree on things, that the poor Ashford widow had finally been broken clean through by her grief. She arrived at the trading post on a gray morning with the last of her strength and the whole of her stubbornness, and stood a long moment in the weeds before the sagging porch, Copper pressed against her leg, both of them looking up at a building that looked, in the flat morning light, considerably more ruined than it had from the courthouse steps. The roof had failed entirely over the back third of the structure, letting 30 years of rain wash straight through onto a floor gone soft and black with rot. The front counter, where Jedediah Pruitt had once weighed out flour and traded for pelts, still stood, warped and gray, beneath a ceiling of cobwebs thick as bunting. But the front room and the main storeroom beyond it were dry, the walls sound, the old stone chimney standing straight as a soldier, and Clementine, who had spent a lifetime learning to see what a broken thing might become, found herself, despite everything, almost smiling. She would live in the dry front rooms, she decided, and mend the roof over the rest as she was able, and she would see whether the crossing at Widow's Creek, once a natural stopping point for anyone traveling the old Cutbank Road, might still have some life of trade left in it, if a resourceful woman, with good bookkeeping, and a talent for mending things, was willing to work for it. It was on her 3rd evening there, while she swept 30 years of dust from the storeroom floor by lantern light, that Copper first began to behave strangely. He had been dozing by the cold hearth, as was his habit, when he suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and rose to pad the length of the storeroom's back wall with his nose low to the floorboards, sniffing along the seam where the wall met the stone chimney with an intensity Clementine had rarely seen in him, except when tracking a rabbit through brush. She called him off gently, thinking little of it. Old buildings held old smells, mice and rot, and the ghosts of 100 forgotten goods, and he came to her obediently enough, but he returned to that same seam of wall the following morning, and the morning after that, scratching now, low and insistent, at a section of paneling that looked, to Clementine's eye, no different from any other section of the storeroom wall. It was the 4th morning that she finally knelt beside him, more to satisfy her own curiosity than his, and ran her hand along the boards where he scratched, and felt, beneath a coat of grime and old whitewash, the faintest seam, a hairline gap, where two boards did not quite meet the way boards ought to meet, running vertical from floor to a height just over her head, and then a second seam crossing it near the top, forming, when she stood back and looked at it properly for the first time, the unmistakable outline of a narrow door, built flush into the wall and papered over with decades of dust until it had all but disappeared into the timber around it. Copper sat back on his haunches beside her, tail sweeping the floor in slow, satisfied strokes, watching her with the particular patient expectancy of a dog who has done his job and is now waiting for the person he loves to catch up. Clementine spent the better part of that day working the hidden door free, first with her fingers, then with a chisel borrowed from the wagon's meager toolbox, easing 30 years of swelling and grime away from a latch so cleverly recessed into the frame that she nearly missed it twice. When the door finally gave, swinging inward on hinges that groaned like something waking from a long sleep, it opened not onto a closet or a chimney flue as she had half expected, but onto a narrow space, no larger than a pantry, built between the storeroom wall and the outer wall of the building, dry as a bone thanks to the chimney's warmth at its back, and holding, on a simple shelf, a single iron strongbox, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, a leather ledger. She did not open either that first evening. She stood in the doorway a long while instead, lantern raised, copper pressed warm against her skirts, feeling the particular vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the ground beneath a familiar story was never quite solid at all. When she finally carried the strongbox and the ledger into the lantern light of the front room, and worked the strongbox's simple lock loose with the same chisel, she found inside it, not the fortune a more romantic mind might have imagined, but something in its way more valuable. Coin, yes, some $300 in gold and silver, more money than she had seen in one place in her life. But beneath the coin, carefully separated by a board Pruitt himself had clearly built to protect it, a stack of papers that made her sit down hard on the floorboards and read by lantern light until the candle guttered low. The ledger, in Jedediah Pruitt's own careful, spidery hand, recorded contributions from 11 families of the Hollow toward the building of a schoolhouse and a church, gathered over 4 years, each entry dated and initialed, the very fund the town had long believed lost with Pruitt's death. But it was the papers beneath the ledger that made Clementine's hands go cold. Deeds, several of them, for parcels along Widow's Creek and the Cutbank Road, parcels that Pruitt, in the last months of his life, had apparently purchased quietly on behalf of the contributing families. Intending, the ledger's final entries made this plain, in language grown shaky as his fever worsened, to hold the land in trust until the school and church fund was complete, so that no single man could ever come to control the whole of the crossing and hold the valley's growth hostage to his own ambition. Pruitt had died before he could tell anyone what he had done, or return the deeds to their rightful families, and the land, unclaimed and unremembered, had over the following decades quietly reverted, parcel by parcel, into the hands of the county, and from the county, through a series of purchases Clementine recognized with a growing, sick certainty, as she traced the dates, into the hands of the Larkspur Valley Trust, and more specifically, into the personal holdings of Silas Merrick's late father, and now Silas Merrick himself. The deepening of the mystery took Clementine the better part of 2 weeks to fully untangle, and she did it the only way she knew how, patiently, methodically, the way her father had taught her to work a broken hinge back into true. She spread Pruitt's ledger and its accompanying deeds across the old trading post counter each evening, and cross-referenced them, name by name, against what she knew of the valley's families, and what little she could learn, through careful and casual questions at the mercantile and the church social, about which of the old founding families still held their original land, and which had, over the years, sold or lost, or been persuaded to relinquish parcels to the trust. Copper lay at her feet through every long evening of this work, occasionally rising to nose at the strongbox itself, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that the box and its contents remained the heart of the matter, and once, memorably, pawing insistently at the ledger's back cover until Clementine, exasperated and amused in equal measure, opened it to find a final loose page tucked into a slit in the binding. A simple, plainly worded letter in Pruitt's hand, addressed to no one in particular, and everyone at once, explaining exactly what he had done, and why. Apparently written in a moment when he suspected his illness might take him before he could finish his work, and asking whoever found it to see that the land was returned to the families who had trusted him with their money. What emerged, by the end of those 2 weeks, was a picture considerably larger and considerably darker than a simple lost fund. Pruitt had not merely misplaced the school money, he had, in his quiet and careful way, been protecting the valley's future from a danger he had apparently seen coming even then. The danger of a single man, or a single institution, coming to own the crossing that every family in the hollow depended upon to bring goods in and crops out. And Silas Merrick's father, Clementine now understood, studying the county's purchase records with a cold, careful eye, had acquired those forgotten, unclaimed parcels, not by accident, but by design, watching and waiting for exactly the kind of quiet county sale that swallowed unclaimed land whole, and Silas himself had spent the 2 years since his father's death quietly finishing the work, foreclosing on homestead after homestead along the creek, including, she now realized, with a fresh and different grief, her own, until the trust controlled nearly the entire crossing, save for the one crumbling ruin no one had thought worth bidding on. The trading post that everyone had called worthless was in fact the last piece Silas Merrick needed and had never managed to acquire, and Clementine Ashford, without knowing it, had just bought it out from under him for $22. There was one more piece of the ledger's story that Clementine did not fully understand until her 3rd week at the trading post, when she finally worked up the nerve to ride out to the Calder place and ask old Ferris Calder, the valley's oldest living resident, what he remembered of Jedediah Pruitt himself. Ferris was well past 70 by then, half blind and slow of speech, but his memory of that autumn 30 years gone was clearer than his memory of the previous week, and he told her, sitting on his own porch with Copper's head resting companionably on his knee, that Pruitt had come to him in the last month of his life, looking thin, and fevered, and strange, and had said only that he had done something the town would not understand for a long while, but that it was the right thing, and that he trusted the crossing to look after itself until someone came who knew how to look. Clementine had ridden home from that conversation, with a new and heavier understanding of what she carried in her satchel. Not merely a fortune misplaced, but a dying man's last act of faith in people he would never live to see proved right, and she resolved, more firmly than ever, that she would not be the one to let that faith go unanswered. It did not take long for Silas Merrick to learn what had become of the old Pruitt place, or to come calling. He arrived on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, in a buggy too fine for the rutted Cutbank Road, dressed in the same dark, respectable coat he wore to every foreclosure, and found Clementine on the half-repaired porch with a hammer in her hand, and Copper rising from the top step to plant himself, low growling and immovable, between the banker and the woman he had come to see. Merrick was, as ever, polite. He admired the repairs. He expressed sympathy, again, for her situation, and then, in the same unhurried tone he had used to take her home from her, offered to buy the trading post from her outright. A generous sum, he called it, more than fair for a ruin, more money than she had seen since Daniel's death, enough to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere kinder to a woman alone. Clementine, who had spent 2 weeks with Jedediah Pruitt's careful handwriting laid open before her every evening, understood exactly what the offer meant, and exactly how frightened a man must be to make it so quickly, and she declined, as politely as he had asked, and watched something harden behind his eyes before he climbed back into his buggy and drove away. Later that same week, one of Merrick's clerks, a nervous young man named Otis Weld, who kept the trust's books, and had clearly been sent to feel out how much Clementine actually knew, rode out to the trading post under the pretense of asking after her repair progress. Copper met him at the porch steps, with none of the easy friendliness he showed honest visitors, planting himself squarely in the young man's path, and holding him there with a low steady growl, until Clementine came out and called him off, and she would say afterward that she trusted her dog's judgment of the man's character rather more than she trusted his own carefully rehearsed pleasantries. Weld left without learning much, but Clementine understood from the visit alone that Merrick was already worried, and that a worried man given time to think was a far more dangerous thing than a confident one. What followed was not violence. Merrick was too careful a man for that, but the slower, more familiar violence of a small town's opinion, turned by a whispered word here and a called-in favor there. Within a fortnight, the mercantile owner, who had promised to carry goods on consignment for her reopened post, suddenly found reasons to delay. A supplier in the county seat, who had agreed to extend her credit, discovered, upon reflection, that he could not. Two men who had offered to help repair her roof found themselves too busy to come. Clementine understood, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that Silas Merrick meant to starve her out of the property the same slow way he had built his hold over the rest of the valley, patiently, respectably, without ever once raising his voice or breaking a law. She might have despaired, in another season of her life. Instead, she sat one more evening with Pruitt's ledger open on the counter, Copper's head heavy across her boots, and understood that the fight in front of her was no longer only her own. She spent the following week doing the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She worked the problem patiently, the way she had worked every broken hinge her father ever set before her. She copied Pruitt's ledger entries by hand, family by family, and one by one she began visiting the 11 households whose names appeared in it: the Calders, the Osgoods, the Fentresses, and 8 others besides, not to accuse or alarm, but simply to sit at their tables, as a neighbor, and ask quiet questions about parcels they had once owned, and no longer did, and to listen, with her father's patience, as old griefs about foreclosures they had long assumed were simple bad luck began, family by family, to take on a different and far less accidental shape. Copper went with her to every visit, and more than one skeptical farmer's wife found her doubts softening at the sight of a dog who sat so calm and devoted at a stranger's feet, as though his trust in the woman were itself a kind of testimony. By the time the town's quarterly meeting was called at the church hall, ostensibly to discuss the coming harvest tax, though Clementine suspected, and was later proven right, that Merrick himself had set the date hoping to use the gathering to publicly and respectably finish isolating her, she had 11 families standing quietly at her back. Pruitt's ledger and deeds copied and ready in a leather satchel, and Copper at her heel, as she walked to the front of the hall past Silas Merrick's carefully composed, faintly pitying smile. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, from a lifetime of mending things rather than breaking them, that the truth did not need shouting, only laying out plainly where everyone could see it. She read Jedediah Pruitt's final letter aloud, in his own words, and then she read the ledger entries, name by name, watching the color drain slowly from Silas Merrick's face, as each family recognized their own contribution, their own lost parcel, their own forgotten grief, finally given its true shape. She laid the deeds on the table at the front of the hall, and the strong box beside them, and told the town plainly that the school and church fund they had believed lost for 30 years, had never been lost at all, only hidden, by a man who had died trying to protect it from exactly the kind of quiet, respectable theft that had followed. Silas Merrick tried, for a time, the same calm and reasonable tone that had served him so well in his office above the mercantile, suggesting that old papers proved nothing, that the county's purchases had been entirely legal, that a widow's ruin of a building was hardly the place to be litigating 3-decade-old rumors. But Clementine had spent 2 weeks learning every date and signature in that ledger, the way she had once learned every seam of a cracked hinge, and she answered him point by point, calmly, until the room itself turned against him, not because of her words alone, but because 11 families now stood in that hall holding proof, at last, of what they had always quietly suspected and never dared to say aloud. It was old Ferris Calder, whose father's name appeared third in Pruitt's ledger, who finally stood and said what the whole room was thinking: that a bank built on land it had no honest right to, held no honest claim to anyone's mortgage either, and that the town would be wanting a proper accounting of every foreclosure the trust had filed in the last 2 years. The county assessor, summoned within the month, agreed, and by the time the snow came that winter, Silas Merrick had resigned the presidency of the Larkspur Valley Trust, under an inquiry he could not survive, and the parcels he had claimed, including, at last, Clementine's own homestead along Widow's Creek, were returned, one by one, to the families Jedediah Pruitt had spent his last quiet months trying to protect. The $300 in the strongbox, Clementine insisted, from the very first evening she understood what it was, belonged not to her, but to the purpose Pruitt had died trying to serve, and it was that money, added to what the 11 families could now spare once their land was restored to them, that finally raised the schoolhouse Larkspur Hollow had been promised for 30 years, built not 20 yards from the trading post's front porch, so that the crossing Pruitt had fought to keep open for everyone became, at last, exactly what he had intended it to be: not one man's private holding, but the beating center of a town that belonged again to all of its families equally. Clementine kept the trading post, repaired it board by board through that first hard winter and the easier one that followed, and turned it back into what it had been in Pruitt's day, a place where a resourceful woman with good bookkeeping and a talent for mending broken things could make an honest living trading fairly with her neighbors. We began this story with a woman who had lost everything and bought a ruin for $22 because she had nothing left to lose in the trying, and it would be easy, looking back, to call that foolishness rewarded, luck dressed up as destiny. But Clementine Ashford never saw it that way, and neither, we think, should we. She did not stumble into Jedediah Pruitt's secret. She knelt down and looked closely at what her dog was trying to tell her, the way her father had taught her to look closely at any broken thing before deciding what it was worth. She did not restore the town by seizing a fortune for herself. She restored it by doing, patiently and honestly, exactly what she had always done, mending what was broken, seam by seam, until the truth held together on its own. And Copper, who had once been a trembling half-starved pup nobody else wanted, who had guarded her fence lines, and walked a half-pace ahead of her through every hardship since, was the one who found the door nobody else had thought to look for, because he had never once stopped believing that what was hidden in the walls of a broken, worthless old building might still be worth digging for. Overlooked value, we have come to believe, is rarely gone. It is only waiting, patiently, the way Jedediah Pruitt waited in his ledger for 30 years, for someone stubborn enough, and kind enough, to come looking. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Clementine and Copper's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that quiet patience is its own kind of courage. Before you go, we would love to know, is there something overlooked and undervalued in your own life right now that might be worth a second, closer look? Until next time, stay close.